My name is Harper, I'm 30 years old, and am lying on a hospital gurney bleeding out while my phone keeps going to voicemail. The fluorescent lights above me blur as another contraction rips through my body, and am fumbling with shaking hands to call my parents for the 14th time. Nothing. Just ringing, then that cold, automated voice telling me to leave a message. I know exactly where they are. They're 3 hours away in Chicago at my brother's award ceremony, phones turned off, champagne glasses raised, celebrating him while I'm here losing my baby. The nurse squeezes my hand and says something about emergency surgery, but all I can hear is my own voice echoing in my head saying they chose him again, they always choose him, and now I might die knowing I was never enough. Before we dive into what happened that night, I need you to know something. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because this story needs to be heard everywhere. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever been the second choice, hit that like button right now. And please, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what I'm about to share will show you exactly what happens when parents play favorites. And trust me, you won't believe how far some people will go to protect the golden child. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare really began, long before that hospital room, back to a childhood where I learned that my brother's dreams would always matter more than my life. Growing up in suburban Texas, I learned early that love in our family wasn't divided equally. It was poured entirely into one vessel, my brother Bennett, who arrived 3 years after me like a promised prince. From the moment he took his first breath, the world tilted on its axis, and I found myself sliding into the shadows. I remember being 7 years old, standing in our living room in my homemade dance recital costume that I'd sewn myself from old bedsheets, watching my parents load Bennett's expensive baseball equipment into the car. My dance teacher had called to confirm my spot in the spring showcase, but Mom had told her we couldn't afford the $50 costume fee. That same week, Dad paid $300 for private batting coaching for Bennett because, as he said while ruffling my brother's hair, the boy had potential, he was going places, he was going to be somebody. The pattern calcified as we grew older, becoming as much a part of our family structure as the dining room table where we ate dinner in silence unless Bennett had something to share. High school was particularly brutal. I worked 25 hours a week at Mi's Diner on Route 12, smelling like grease and coffee, saving every tip in a shoebox under my bed so I could afford a prom dress. I'd found a beautiful blue one at the consignment shop for $85, and I was so close to having enough. Then Bennett turned 16, and Dad pulled into the driveway with a silver Honda Civic tied with a red bow. I watched from my bedroom window as my parents filmed Bennett's reaction. Mom crying happy tears, Dad beaming with pride, and I realized the car cost more than I'd make in an entire year of slinging hash browns. Nobody mentioned my prom, which was 2 weeks away. I ended up borrowing a dress from my friend Stella that didn't quite fit, and when I came downstairs for photos, Mom barely looked up from addressing Bennett's birthday party invitations. College was when I truly understood that I was on my own in this world. I'd worked hard, maintained a decent grade point average, despite having no quiet study space at home, because Bennett's band practiced in the garage right below my room. I got accepted to the University of Houston with partial academic scholarship, but I'd still need help covering room, board, and books. I sat my parents down at the kitchen table one Sunday morning, hands trembling as I showed them the financial aid package, explaining I'd need about $8,000 per year if I worked part-time. Dad didn't even look at the papers. He just said they couldn't afford it, not with Bennett starting at Texas State in the fall and needing full support since he'd be playing club baseball and wouldn't have time for a job. The inequality was so blatant, so casually cruel, that I couldn't even form words. Bennett got a full ride, tuition, housing, meal plan, spending money, while I took out student loans that I'm still paying off today. Mom's only comment was that girls are naturally more independent, that I'd figure it out, that I always did. I did figure it out, but it cost me more than money. It cost me the naive belief that parents love their children equally. I worked full-time while taking classes, graduated in 5 years instead of 4, missed countless experiences because I was too exhausted or too broke to participate. Meanwhile, Bennett coasted through college on our parents' dime, changed majors 3 times, barely graduated, and was welcomed home each summer like a returning war hero. I met Wyatt during my senior year at a coffee shop near campus where I worked the opening shift. He came in every morning at 6, ordered black coffee and a blueberry muffin, and always left a generous tip. He was from a modest family in Louisiana, the middle of 5 kids, and when I eventually told him about my family dynamics, he understood in a way nobody else had. His family hadn't had much money, but love wasn't rationed, attention wasn't a competition, support wasn't conditional on achievement. He showed me what normal looked like, and it made me realize just how abnormal my childhood had been. We got married 3 years later when I was 25. A small ceremony at the courthouse followed by dinner at a local Italian restaurant with 15 guests. I'd wanted small and intimate anyway, but my parents complained constantly that it wasn't nice enough, that people would judge them, that they couldn't properly celebrate their daughter's wedding in such a casual setting. They arrived 30 minutes late because Bennett had an important meeting with a potential employer that ran over, and they didn't want to miss it. During the dinner, Dad gave a speech that somehow lasted 11 minutes despite our wedding lasting 11 minutes, and he spent 10 of those minutes talking about Bennett's recent promotion to assistant manager at a sporting goods store. He mentioned how proud they were to have raised such an ambitious son, how Bennett was really making something of himself, how the family name was being elevated by his success. He added at the very end, almost as an afterthought, that he was sure it'd do just fine in life too. Mom cried during the speech, but not from joy about my marriage. She cried because she thought the restaurant was too shabby for a family celebration, because she worried what the guests thought, because in her mind, this low-key wedding reflected poorly on Bennett's status. I sat there in my $200 dress from David's Bridal, holding Wyatt's hand under the table, and promised myself that when I had children, they would never know this kind of conditional love. After 3 years of marriage, 3 years of building a life with Wyatt that felt stable and safe and ours, I saw 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test and felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. Not just hope for a baby, but hope that maybe this would shift something fundamental in my family. Surely becoming a grandmother would soften my mother's edges. Surely my father would see me as more than just the daughter who required less attention. I called them that evening, hands shaking with excitement, and Mom answered on the 3rd ring. I could hear the television in the background, one of those home renovation shows she loved. I told her the news, tried to keep my voice steady even though I wanted to scream it from rooftops. There was a pause, a long pause, and then she said, "That's nice, dear," in the same tone she might use if Eid told her Eid bought new dish towels. Before I could respond, she launched into a story about how Bennett had just gotten promoted to regional manager at his company, how they'd taken him and his wife Sienna out for a celebratory dinner at the steakhouse downtown, how proud they were of his upward trajectory. I stood in my bathroom, staring at myself in the mirror, watching tears slide down my face while my mother talked about my brother's job for 12 straight minutes without asking a single question about my pregnancy. The first trimester was harder than I'd expected. I had spotting at 8 weeks that sent me into a panic, cramping that doubled me over at work, exhaustion so profound I could barely keep my eyes open past 7 in the evening. My doctor, a kind woman named Patricia Wad, been practicing for 30 years, told me everything was probably fine but that I needed to reduce stress and get more rest. I was working as an office manager at a small architecture firm, and my boss was understanding about me leaving early for appointments, but I still felt guilty taking time off. I called my mother during week 10, thinking maybe I could stay with them for a few days, just to rest, just to be taken care of the way I'd seen other pregnant women cared for by their mothers. She sighed into the phone and said, she'd love to help, but they were incredibly busy. Bennett and Sienna were moving into a new house across town, a 4-bedroom colonial with a 2-car garage, and Mom had promised to help with the packing, the cleaning, the organizing, the decorating. She said it in a way that made it clear Bennett's move took priority over my pregnancy complications, and I didn't push back because what would be the point? At 13 weeks, we found out that Sienna was also pregnant, due about 8 weeks before me. I learned this not from a phone call, not from a family announcement, but from a Facebook post with professional maternity photos. Sienna stood in a flowing white dress in a field at sunset, hand on her barely there belly, while Bennett knelt beside her kissing her stomach. The caption read, "Our greatest adventure begins in March," with a string of baby emojis. I called to congratulate them, doing what family is supposed to do. And Mom answered Bennett's phone. They were all together, apparently, having brunch to celebrate. Nobody had invited me. Mom gushed about how exciting it was, how she couldn't wait to be a grandmother, how they'd already started planning the nursery design. I mentioned, voice small, that I was due in May, just 2 months later. She said, "Oh, right, yes, that's wonderful, honey. But had I seen Sienna's announcement photos, weren't they just stunning? They'd hired a professional photographer for $300, and the results were absolutely worth it." My own pregnancy announcement had been a simple text in the family group chat with a photo of the ultrasound. 2 people reacted to it with thumbs-up emojis. My Aunt Teresa, who lived in New Mexico and barely knew any of us, and Wyatt's sister. The baby shower differential made everything painfully clear. Mom called at week 20 of my pregnancy, right after Eid had my anatomy scan confirming a healthy baby girl. She said they needed to talk about celebrations, and my heart lifted thinking maybe, finally, she wanted to plan something special for me. Instead, she launched into details about Sienna's shower. They'd rented out the private room at the country club, hired a caterer, sent embossed invitations to 80 guests, ordered a custom cake shaped like a baby carriage. The budget was somewhere around $4,000. Then she cleared her throat and said that unfortunately, they couldn't afford to do 2 big parties so close together, so my shower would need to be simpler. She suggested a casual get-together at her house, maybe a potluck, just close family. I sat on my couch, hand on my belly where my daughter kicked, and asked how many people she was thinking. She said, probably 12, maybe 15 if some people brought their kids. The contrast was staggering, humiliating, but worse than the unequal treatment was the casual way she delivered this information, as if it were perfectly reasonable that one grandchild deserved thousands of dollars and 80 guests, while the other deserved a potluck with 15 people. Sienna's shower was in February, and I attended even though everything in me screamed to stay home. The country club room was decorated in silver and white, with enormous balloon arrangements and a gift table that groaned under the weight of expensive presents. Designer strollers, high-end cribs, luxury bedding sets, a $600 baby monitor system. Mom and Dad worked the room like proud hosts, thanking everyone for coming, posing for photos with Bennett and Sienna, beaming with grandparent pride. I sat at a back table with Wyatt, who kept squeezing my hand under the table, and watched my parents embody the kind of joy I'd always wanted them to feel about me. My own shower happened 3 weeks later in Mom's living room, with paper plates and store-bought cookies. 14 people came. There was no photographer, no decorations beyond a single banner that said "baby shower" in generic pastel letters. The gifts were lovely and thoughtful, mostly practical items and handmade blankets, but it wasn't about the gifts. It was about what the disparity represented. My daughter would always be less important, less celebrated, less loved than Bennett's son. Week 24 brought another ultrasound, this time to check on something the technician had seen, a potential issue with blood flow that turned out to be nothing. But I was scared, sitting in that darkened room watching my baby's heartbeat flutter on the screen, and I called Mom afterward, asking if she could come with me to my next appointment. I told her I'd been anxious, that I just needed her there. She said Shed loved to, but Shed already promised to help Bennett and Sienna paint the nursery that day. They were doing a woodland theme with hand-painted trees and animals, and Shed committed to helping with the mural. I drove home alone, pulled into my driveway, rested my head on the steering wheel, and sobbed so hard my ribs ached. Wyatt found me there 20 minutes later when he got home from work. He held me in the car while I cried, and then he said the words I'd been avoiding. I should cut them off. Stop trying. Stop hoping they'd change. I defended them even then, told him they were still my family, that they'd come around when the baby arrived, that grandparent love would transform them. He looked at me with such sadness and said he hoped I was right, but he didn't believe it. At 28 weeks, I had severe back pain one afternoon when Wyatt was at a 3-day work conference in Dallas. I could barely stand up straight, worried something was wrong with the baby, and needed someone to drive me to the hospital for a checkup. I called Dad, explained the situation, asked if he could take me. He said he couldn't. He was at home streaming Bennett's big presentation for a potential investor. Bennett's company was trying to secure funding, and this presentation was crucial, and Dad wasn't going to miss it even though it was virtual and could be watched later. I ended up calling an Uber, sitting in the back seat, trying not to cry while a driver named Marcus made small talk about the weather. The hospital waiting room was full, And I sat there for 45 minutes watching other pregnant women with their mothers, their partners, their support systems, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt. The back pain turned out to be normal pregnancy discomfort, nothing serious, but the emotional pain of being abandoned in that moment carved something hollow in my chest. That night, I started a journal addressed to my unborn daughter. The first entry said, "I promise you will never feel invisible. I promise you will never wonder if ill show up. I promise you will never be second best. I don't know how to fix my relationship with my parents, but I know how to break this cycle. You will be loved, completely and without condition, because you exist. That's the only reason needed." At 32 weeks pregnant, moving through the world like a ship navigating narrow straits, I got the call that would ultimately change everything. Bennett phoned on a Tuesday evening while I was folding tiny onesies on the couch, my feet swollen and propped on pillows. He said he needed to announce something at family dinner that Sunday, something important, and everyone needed to be there. I agreed, curious, despite my better judgment, and spent the week wondering what could warrant such formal announcement. Sunday came, and Wyatt and I drove to my parents' house, where Mom had made her famous pot roast that she only made for special occasions. Bennett and Sienna were already there, their 2-month-old son Easton sleeping in a carrier on the floor. Bennett stood at the head of the table, once wed, all sat down, cleared his throat dramatically, and announced that had been selected to receive the Regional Sales Excellence Award from his company. The ceremony was in 5 weeks at a hotel in Chicago, black tie event, huge honor. Only 5 people nationwide received it annually. Mom immediately burst into tears, actual tears streaming down her face, saying how proud she was, how she always knew He'd achieve great things, how this proved everything that invested in him was worth it. Dad stood up and hugged Bennett, clapping him on the back in that way men do when they're too emotional to speak. Sienna beamed, talking about how Shed already bought a new dress for the occasion, how they'd make a weekend of it in Chicago. Then Mom started planning aloud, talking about booking a hotel room for her and Dad, maybe arriving Friday night so they could have dinner before the ceremony Saturday evening. She pulled out her phone right there at the table and started looking at hotels, reading options aloud, asking Bennett which would be closest to the venue. The ceremony was scheduled for Saturday, March 18th at 7 in the evening. I did quick mental math while pushing pot roast around my plate. March 18th. I would be exactly 37 weeks pregnant. I waited for a lull in the celebration, then mentioned as casually as I could manage that I'd be 37 weeks pregnant that day, which is considered full term, which means the baby could come at any time. The table went quiet for about 3 seconds before Mom waved her hand dismissively and said, "First babies are always late. That I'd probably go to 40 weeks or beyond, that I was worrying for nothing." Bennett added that it was just one evening, just a few hours, that I was being dramatic as usual. Sienna, who'd delivered Easton at 38 weeks, chimed in with, "See, I made it, you will too, first babies never come early." Dad said nothing, just nodded along with Mom's assessment, already back to looking at hotel options on his phone. I felt Wyatt tense beside me, his hand finding mine under the table, gripping tight. I tried again, said that my doctor had warned me at my last appointment that the baby's position suggested I might deliver before my due date, that 37 weeks means the baby is developed enough to come safely, but that it happens often. Mom's face hardened in that way it did when Shed made up her mind. She said I was catastrophizing, that I always looked for reasons to make things difficult, that surely I wouldn't begrudge my brother this one special night. The guilt trip began in earnest then. Bennett said He'd worked incredibly hard for this award, that it was a huge milestone in his career, that family support meant everything to him. Sienna added that Shed be there supporting him even with a new baby, that she was making it work, implying I should do the same. Dad finally spoke, saying that I'd always seemed jealous of Bennett's accomplishments, that it was time to be happy for him instead of making everything about me. The accusation hit like a slap. Jealous. I'd never been jealous of Bennett's success. I'd been desperate for equal love, for equal attention, for equal value in my parents' eyes. Success had nothing to do with it. But explaining that would require them to see a pattern they'd spent 3 decades perfecting, and people don't want to see what makes them uncomfortable. I looked at Wyatt, saw the anger in his eyes, saw him opening his mouth to defend me. I squeezed his hand, shook my head slightly. Fighting here wouldn't change anything. It would just make me the villain in a story where I'd always been cast as the difficult daughter. We agreed that Wyatt and I would stay home while they went to Chicago. Mom looked relieved, said she knew it'd be reasonable, that she appreciated me being mature about this. We finished dinner making small talk about nursery themes and baby names. The elephant in the room, invisible to everyone but Wyatt and me. On the drive home, he finally exploded. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he said he couldn't believe what had just witnessed. Couldn't believe they expected me to just accept being second priority while 9 months pregnant. Couldn't believe they'd chosen an award ceremony over being available in case their daughter went into labor. I stared out the window at houses sliding past, lit from within, full of families I'd never know, families that might love more equally. I told Wyatt that maybe they were right. Maybe first babies do come late. Maybe I was worrying over nothing. He pulled into our driveway, put the car in park, and turned to face me. He said that wasn't the point, that even if I delivered 2 weeks late, they should be staying close, staying available, putting me first for once in my life. I started crying then and said the word that had defined my entire existence, once. The next few weeks crawled by with increasing physical discomfort and emotional dread. At my 35-week appointment, Dr. Patricia did an exam and told me the baby had dropped significantly, that her head was engaged in my pelvis, that she could come any time now. She asked if I had support in place, if my mother would be nearby, if everything was arranged. I lied and said yes, everything was fine, I had plenty of help. I didn't mention that my mother would be 3 hours away at a ceremony honoring her son while I potentially delivered her granddaughter. Dr. Patricia seemed skeptical but didn't push. She just said to call immediately if my water broke or if contractions started, that second stages of labor can progress quickly, that I shouldn't wait. I nodded, took the appointment card for the following week, and walked out to my car where I sat crying in the parking lot for 20 minutes. That evening, I tried one more time with Mom. I called her, kept my voice even, explained what the doctor had said about the baby dropping. Mom said that doctors always say things like that to keep patients cautious, that it didn't mean anything, that it'd be fine. Then she launched into details about her dress for the ceremony, how Shed found a beautiful navy blue gown at Nordstrom on sale, how she couldn't wait to see Bennett receive his award. The conversation lasted 18 minutes. 16 of those minutes were about the award ceremony. 2 were about my pregnancy. Bennett texted the day before they left with a long message about how much this award meant to him, how he hoped there were no hard feelings, how he knew I understood that career milestones like this only come once in a lifetime. I read it 3 times, searching for any acknowledgement that I was 9 months pregnant, that there might be a conflict, that he saw any irony in asking me to understand while showing zero understanding for my situation. There was nothing. Wyatt read it over my shoulder and said I didn't have to respond. But I did respond, because I wasn't ready to burn everything down yet. Wasn't ready to be the difficult daughter who couldn't be happy for her brother. I texted back, congratulations, said I was proud of him, said I hoped he had a wonderful evening. 3 lies in 1 message. He sent back a thumbs up emoji. That was it. That was the extent of his gratitude for my understanding. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with my hands on my belly, feeling my daughter kick and roll, and whispered to her about the family she'd be born into, the grandparents who might never make her a priority, the uncle who saw her existence as secondary to his achievements. I promised her again what I'd promised in my journal. She would be loved, truly loved, by Wyatt and me. We would be enough, even if we were all she had. Saturday, March 18th dawned gray and cold. The kind of morning where the sky can't decide between rain and sun and settles for neither. I woke at 6 with a dull ache in my lower back that I tried to ignore, chalking it up to sleeping in an awkward position. My belly felt heavy, lower than usual, and moving from bed to bathroom required careful maneuvering. Wyatt was still asleep, and I didn't wake him, just started my day like any other Saturday. Made tea, tried to eat toast that tasted like cardboard, sat on the couch scrolling through my phone and seeing nothing. The ache in my back intensified by mid-morning, spreading around to my sides, and I realized I'd been timing them unconsciously. 15 minutes apart. Probably Braxton Hicks contractions, I told myself. The practice contractions everyone talks about. Nothing to worry about. At noon, I tried calling Mom just to hear her voice, needing the comfort of my mother even if she'd never truly comforted me. She answered breathless and distracted, said she was at the salon getting her hair done for tonight. Could she call me back later? I said sure, of course, didn't mention the pain. She hung up without saying goodbye. By 2 in the afternoon, my parents were on the road to Chicago, a 3-hour drive that would put them there by 5, plenty of time to check into the hotel and get ready for the 7 o'clock ceremony. Bennett and Sienna had left that morning to arrive even earlier. I knew all this because Mom had texted me their itinerary, complete with hotel details and ceremony location, as if I needed to know where they'd be while I sat home alone and pregnant. The back pain had morphed into something more intense, waves of pressure that made me catch my breath, but I convinced myself it was nothing. First babies come late. Everyone said so. At 3:30, I stood up from the couch and felt wetness between my legs, warm liquid running down my thighs, soaking through my sweatpants. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring down at the puddle forming on the hardwood floor, my mind refusing to process what was happening. Then, panic hit like ice water in my veins. My water had broken. The baby was coming. I was 37 weeks and 2 days pregnant, and my baby was coming right now. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called Wyatt at work. He was at the office catching up on paperwork, only 30 minutes away, and he answered on the first ring. I could barely get the words out through my panic. Water broke, need hospital now, baby's coming. He said he was leaving immediately, told me to call my parents, told me to stay calm, said he'd be there in 20 minutes. I hung up and immediately dialed Mom's cell phone. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail, again. Voicemail. They were driving, I told myself. They probably had their phones on silent for the drive. They'd see the missed calls soon. I tried Dad's phone. Straight to voicemail, meaning his phone was off completely. Tried Bennett. Voicemail. Tried Sienna. Voicemail. I stood in my living room, water still trickling down my legs, contractions starting to build in intensity, and realized with horrifying clarity that I couldn't reach anyone in my family. The next 15 minutes were chaos. I called my parents' phones over and over, trying mom, dad, back and forth in a desperate rhythm. I sent texts to the family group chat in all capital letters, water broke, in labor, need you to call. I texted Mom directly. Emergency, baby coming, please answer. Nothing came back, just the hollow silence of unanswered messages piling up in the void. Contractions were coming faster now, 7 minutes apart, hard enough to double me over, gripping the back of the couch. I tried to breathe through them like Wed learned in birthing class, but panic made it impossible to focus. Where was Wyatt? Why wasn't he here yet? Why wouldn't my parents answer their phones? I called Mom again, and this time left a voicemail, voice breaking. Mom, please, my water broke. I'm going to the hospital. Please call me back, I need you. I sent one more text to Bennett. Emergency, Mom and Dad not answering. Baby in distress, please tell them to call. I watched the text change from delivered to read, those little blue check marks appearing that meant he'd seen it. I stared at my phone, waiting for the typing indicator, waiting for something. Nothing came. Wyatt burst through the door at 4:15, found me on my hands and knees in the living room riding out a contraction, my hospital bag unpacked and contents scattered around me because I couldn't remember what I'd needed to pack. He helped me up, grabbed random items and threw them in the bag, got me to the car, drove faster than he'd ever driven while I called my parents again and again from the passenger seat. Still nothing. We arrived at the hospital at 4:45, and the intake nurse took one look at me and rushed us to a labor and delivery room. They got me into a gown, hooked up to monitors, checked my dilation, 4 centimeters. The baby's heart rate was on the monitor, that rapid drumbeat that should have filled me with joy but instead amplified my fear because it kept having decelerations, dropping lower than it should. The nurse frowned at the monitor, adjusted the sensors, called for the doctor. I kept trying to call my parents between contractions, phone pressed to my ear, listening to it ring and ring. By 6 o'clock, I'd been at the hospital for over an hour, and made 17 calls to my mother, 11 to my father, 8 to Bennett. Not a single person had called back. Not one. The texts piled up in my phone. a record of my desperation. Please answer. Scared. The baby's heart rate is dropping. I need you. Where are you? Please, Mom, please. I knew exactly where they were. They were at the hotel in Chicago getting ready, Mom doing her makeup, Dad adjusting his tie, all of them preparing for Bennett's big moment. The award ceremony started at 7. It was now 6:15. My contractions were 5 minutes apart, each one more brutal than the last, and the baby's heart rate kept dipping into dangerous territory. Dr. Patricia came in, examined me, looked at the monitors with growing concern. She said the baby wasn't tolerating labor well, that the heart rate decelerations were worrisome, that we needed to watch closely. I asked through tears if the baby was okay, if she was going to be okay. Dr. Patricia squeezed my hand and said, "Wed, do everything necessary to keep both of us safe." At 7 o'clock, right when Bennett was walking onto the stage in Chicago to receive his award, the alarms on my monitor started screaming. The baby's heart rate had dropped to 70 beats per minute and wasn't coming back up. The room filled with people in scrubs, everyone moving with urgent efficiency, someone unlocking the wheels on my bed, someone else explaining we needed an emergency cesarean section immediately. I was sobbing, reaching for my phone, trying to call my mother one more time while they pushed my bed toward the operating room. "Please, Mom, please answer. I'm having emergency surgery, the baby's dying, please." The phone rang, and then, as they wheeled me through the double doors, it went to voicemail. I listened to my mother's recorded voice asking me to leave a message, while strangers prepped me for surgery that would save my daughter's life, and I realized with complete devastating certainty that my parents had made their choice. They'd seen my messages, they knew I was in crisis, and they'd chosen champagne and applause over me. They'd chosen him, like they always chose him, and this time it might cost me everything. The operating room was bright and cold, all white surfaces and metal instruments that glinted under harsh lights. They transferred me to the operating table while explaining procedures I couldn't process, words like epidural and incision and suction floating past my consciousness. Wyatt appeared beside me in scrubs, face pale behind a surgical mask, eyes wide with fear. He held my hand while the anesthesiologist worked behind me, and I felt pressure in my spine, then slowly, mercifully, numbness spreading through my lower body. The obstetrician, a woman whose name I didn't catch, spoke calmly above me, explaining each step, but all I could focus on was the monitor showing my baby's heart rate, still dangerously low. Someone put up a blue drape blocking my view of my abdomen, and I felt tugging, pressure, strange sensations that I knew intellectually were them cutting me open, but that felt distant and unreal. Wyatt kept whispering it's okay, you're okay, she's going to be okay, but his voice shook with uncertainty. Then there was a different kind of pressure, stronger, and suddenly a cry pierced the air, thin and outraged, and absolutely beautiful. "My daughter?" They lifted her briefly above the drape, a squirming pink creature covered in vernix, face scrunched in fury at being expelled from her warm home. 7 pounds 3 ounces, someone announced. Apgar score 6, then 8. She was alive. She was breathing. They whisked her away to the warming table across the room where a team worked on her, suctioning, examining, while I lay strapped to a table unable to see what was happening. Wyatt looked torn between staying with me and going to see our daughter. I told him to go, to make sure she was okay, and he kissed my forehead before walking to the warming table. I was alone then, staring at ceiling tiles, feeling the obstetrician working inside me, stitching, repairing, and that's when I felt something warm and wet spreading beneath me. The doctor's voice changed tone, became clipped and urgent. "More bleeding than expected, need another unit typed and crossed. Get me the hemostatic agents," words that meant nothing to me but that sent the room into higher alert. I felt strange, floaty, my vision going gray at the edges. Someone was saying my name, Harper, "Stay with us, Harper," but I wanted to close my eyes, wanted to sleep. More hands on me, more urgent voices, something about blood pressure dropping, about potential hemorrhage. The anesthesiologist appeared in my field of vision, face serious, saying they were giving me medication, that I needed to stay awake, to keep talking to him. I tried to focus on his eyes, tried to answer his questions, but the gray was spreading, pulling me under. I thought about my mother, about how she should be here, about how the last thing I'd see might be that blue surgical drape instead of her face. I thought about my daughter in that warming table who might not remember me, who might grow up hearing stories about the mother who died the day she was born. I thought about Bennett on a stage accepting an award while I bled out on an operating table. Then time became fragmented. I remember bright lights, remember voices that seemed far away, remember Wyatt's face above me streaked with tears. I remember someone saying, 2 units of O negative, stat, and feeling coldness in my arm from the blood transfusion. I remember the doctor saying Shed stopped the bleeding, that it was under control, that I was stable. I remember finally being wheeled out of the operating room sometime around 9:30, being settled into a recovery room, being told my daughter was in the NICU for monitoring but doing well. I couldn't move, couldn't lift my head, could barely keep my eyes open, but I managed to whisper to Wyatt to check my phone. Had anyone called? Had my parents finally, after everything, reached out to see if their daughter and grandchild had survived? Wyatt picked up my phone from the bag of my belongings, unlocked it with my face recognition, and his expression turned to stone. He held it up so I could see. 43 notifications, but none were from my parents. They were all from me calling them. 13 missed calls made by me during labor. 17 text messages sent by me, each more desperate than the last. The most recent message Id sent was at 7:42, right before they took me to surgery. Mom, please. I'm hemorrhaging. They're doing emergency surgery. I might die. Please call me. I love you. Below that text, in smaller gray letters, it said, read 7:54 p.m. My mother had seen that message. Shed read it 8 minutes after my surgery started, read that her daughter might be dying, and she hadn't called. She hadn't even sent a text back. I stared at those 2 words, read 7:54 p.m., and felt something crack apart inside my chest that would never fully heal. Wyatt scrolled through my phone with shaking hands and pulled up Instagram. Bennett had posted a story 2 hours ago, time-stamped 9:32. The video showed him on stage in a tuxedo, holding a crystal award shaped like an obelisk, smiling into the camera. Behind him, Mom and Dad stood applauding. Dad's arm around Mom's shoulders, both beaming with pride. The next slide was a photo. Bennett, Sienna, Mom, and Dad, around a table with champagne flutes raised, all laughing. Caption reading, celebrating our champion. So proud. Number family first, number excellence. Posted at 9:47. Exactly when I'd been in recovery being told I'd almost died from blood loss. The next slide was worse. A close-up of the award with Mom's hand touching it reverently, her comment below. Best night ever. My son is a superstar. Dreams really do come true. Timestamp, 10:03. I'd been awake by then, weak and traumatized but awake, and my mother was posting about the best night ever while I'd survived the worst night of my life. Wyatt showed me one more thing before I made him put the phone away. My text to Mom at 7:42. The one about hemorrhaging and emergency surgery, the one that said I might die. Below it, in the message thread, I could see 3 dots appearing and disappearing from 7:54 to 7:56, meaning Shed started typing a response. Shed read my message, started to respond, and then stopped. Chosen not to send whatever Shed written. Chosen to silence her phone and go back to the celebration instead. I closed my eyes against the wave of pain that had nothing to do with my surgical incision. My mother had made an active, conscious choice to ignore my emergency so she wouldn't miss my brother's award dinner. Shed weighed my life against his achievement and found me lacking. This wasn't neglect anymore, wasn't just favoritism taken to an extreme. This was deliberate abandonment. This was choosing to let me die alone rather than interrupt the festivities. This was unforgivable. Morning light filtered through the hospital room blinds when I woke, disoriented and in pain, body heavy and uncooperative. A nurse was checking my vitals, adjusting my IV, speaking in soft tones about pain medication and recovery expectations. Wyatt was asleep in the chair beside my bed, still in yesterday's clothes, face exhausted even in sleep. I tried to speak and my throat was raw, tried to move and my abdomen screamed in protest. The nurse helped me sip water through a straw and explained I'd lost significant blood during surgery, that I'd need to take recovery slowly, that I'd be here for at least 3 more days. I asked about my baby. The nurse smiled and said she was stable in the NICU. oxygen levels good, just needed monitoring for a few more weeks since she'd come early and had distress during delivery. She asked if I wanted to pump breast milk, and I nodded even though lifting my arms seemed impossible. The nurse helped me with the breast pump, a humiliating and painful process that produced barely an ounce of colostrum. I cried through the whole thing, tears running down my face silently while the machine whirred and my breasts ached and my abdomen throbbed and my heart felt shattered into pieces it'd never be able to reassemble. The nurse thought I was crying from physical pain and offered more medication. I didn't correct her. How could I explain that the pain in my body was nothing compared to the pain of being abandoned by my mother while I bled out on an operating table? How could I articulate that I'd almost died and my parents had chosen to stay at a party, that they'd posted celebratory photos on social media while I fought for my life, that they'd read my desperate pleas and decided I wasn't worth leaving early for? The nurse left with the bottle of colostrum to take to the NICU, and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling hollow. Wyatt stirred around 8, jerked awake like he'd been having a nightmare, immediately looked at me with wide eyes checking if I was okay. I nodded, tried to smile. Failed. He came to the bedside and took my hand carefully, mindful of the IV line, and asked how I was feeling. Before I could answer, my phone on the bedside table lit up with an incoming call. Mom. The name on the screen felt surreal after a night of her silence. Wyatt and I looked at each other, and something passed between us, some unspoken question about whether I was ready for this conversation. I wasn't ready, would never be ready, but I needed to hear what she'd say, needed to know if she'd acknowledge what she'd done. I answered on the 4th ring, brought the phone to my ear, said hello in a voice that barely worked. Mom's voice came through high and worried, and completely wrong for the situation. Harper. Oh my God. We just got back to the hotel and saw all your messages from last night. What happened? Are you okay? Why didn't you call sooner? I couldn't form words. Just held the phone to my ear, listening to her performance of concern. This act she was putting on as if she hadn't ignored 14 calls and 17 texts. As if she hadn't read my message about hemorrhaging and dying and chosen not to respond. She kept talking, filling my silence with excuses. They'd had their phones off during the ceremony, it was required, you know how those formal events are, and then the dinner ran so late, and by the time they got back to the hotel it was after midnight, and they didn't want to call so late. They thought everything was fine, they had no idea anything was wrong. Every word was a lie. The read receipts proved she'd seen my messages at 7:54, when the ceremony was barely over, when she could have called, could have left, could have done anything except post celebratory photos on social media. I finally found my voice, hollow and flat. I had the baby. Emergency C-section. She's in the NICU. Mom gasped, asked if the baby was okay, if I was okay, said she felt terrible, said if only she'd known it was so urgent. That phrase, if only she'd known. As if 14 missed calls wasn't enough evidence of urgency. As if a text saying emergency in all capital letters was somehow ambiguous. I said I'd called her 14 times, texted repeatedly, sent messages saying it was an emergency. There was a pause, then she said, well, they'd had their phones off, how were they supposed to know it was serious? I could have been calling about anything. Could have been calling about anything. I'd told her my water broke at 37 weeks, told her the baby's heart rate was dropping, told her I was hemorrhaging, and she wanted me to believe she thought I might have been calling about something trivial. Dad got on the phone then, voice full of forced joviality, calling me princess like he had when I was small and had still pretended to care. He said he heard there was some excitement, that the baby came early, that these things happen, that I was young and strong and recovered quickly. He made it sound like a minor inconvenience, like I'd had a particularly difficult day at work instead of nearly dying in surgery. He said they'd come visit as soon as they got back in town tomorrow, that they couldn't wait to meet their granddaughter, that this was such wonderful news, wonderful news. I'd survived a medical emergency alone and traumatized, and he called it wonderful news. I hung up without saying goodbye, couldn't stand to hear another word. Wyatt took the phone from my shaking hands and I told him what they'd said, how they'd lied about having their phones off, how they'd minimized everything. He was quiet for a long moment, then asked if I wanted him to handle this. I didn't know what handling it meant, but I nodded. Over the next 2 days, while I lay in a hospital bed, learning to stand without passing out, learning to care for my incision, learning to pump milk for a daughter I could only see through NICU windows. My phone exploded with messages from my family. 43 missed calls from mom by day 2, 27 from dad, 38 texts from mom, ranging from cheerful can't wait to visit messages to increasingly frantic why aren't you answering questions. Bennett texted congratulations on the baby, said he heard she came early. Sorry they missed my calls because the ceremony ran late. No acknowledgement of his emergency text, the one where Id explicitly said the baby was in distress and mom and dad weren't answering. No apology for reading that message and not telling our parents immediately. Just casual congratulations as if this were a normal happy birth instead of a traumatic emergency. Sienna sent a long text about how excited she was to have a niece, how Easton needed a cousin to play with, how she couldn't wait for the girls to meet. She suggested we do joint birthday parties to save money since the babies were born so close together. The assumption that we'd be a close family after what they'd done was staggering. Dad texted asking about visiting hours, saying they wanted to bring gifts, saying I shouldn't worry about anything because grandparents were here to help now. Where were they when Id needed help, when I'd been bleeding out alone, when my phone had rung 14 times with no answer? They thought they could just show up now with teddy bears and balloons and everything would be fine, that I'd accept their version of reality where they'd done nothing wrong and this was just an unfortunate miscommunication. A hospital social worker came to see me on day 3, part of routine postpartum screening. She asked standard questions about my support system, my mental health, my home situation. I tried to hold it together, to give appropriate answers, but when she asked if I had family helping me through this difficult time, I broke. Everything spilled out in a rush. My childhood of being second best, the unequal treatment, the pregnancy neglect, the award ceremony, the ignored calls, the emergency surgery, the social media posts while I was dying, all of it. She listened without interruption, taking notes, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before speaking. She said that what I'd described was a pattern of emotional abuse and severe family dysfunction, that the birth emergency was just the culmination of a lifetime of being devalued. She gave me pamphlets about family estrangement, about setting boundaries with toxic relatives, about therapy resources. She suggested very gently that I consider limiting or eliminating contact with family members who had proven they couldn't prioritize my well-being. I told her I couldn't do that. They were my parents. Family is family, you don't just cut off your mother. The social worker looked at me with such compassion and said that parents who love their children don't ignore them during medical emergencies, that blood relation doesn't entitle people to access to my life or my child, that protecting myself and my daughter wasn't cruel, it was necessary. She left the resources on my bedside table and said I didn't have to make any decisions now, just to think about it, to prioritize my healing. After she left, I picked up one of the pamphlets. It was titled, When Family Hurts, Recognizing Abuse and Protecting Yourself. I read it cover to cover while Wyatt went to the NICU to see our daughter, and with every page I felt something shifting inside me, some fundamental understanding clicking into place. The pamphlet described my entire childhood, the scapegoating, the golden child syndrome, the emotional neglect disguised as different parenting styles. All of it had a name, a pattern, a recognition that what I'd experienced wasn't normal or okay. On day 4 in the hospital, I was finally cleared to visit the NICU in a wheelchair. A nurse pushed me through corridors and into the unit where my daughter lay in an incubator under Beely lights for mild jaundice. She was perfect. Tiny and pink with a shock of dark hair, fingers that curled around mine when I reached through the incubator porthole. I sat beside her for 2 hours, just watching her breathe, watching her sleep, feeling love so fierce it physically hurt. This was my daughter, mine and Wyatt's, and I would do anything, to protect her from the pain it endured. If that meant cutting off my parents, cutting off Bennett, building walls around our little family to keep the toxicity out, then that's what I'd do. She would never feel invisible. She would never wonder if she was loved enough. She would never compete for affection or validation. She would be cherished simply because she existed, and that would be enough. I was still in the NICU when Mom showed up at the hospital unannounced. A nurse came to tell me I had visitors in my room, that my mother was there with balloons and gifts, asking where I was. I asked the nurse to tell her I wasn't available, that I wasn't ready for visitors. The nurse left and came back 10 minutes later saying my mother was insisting, getting upset, demanding to see her daughter and granddaughter. I asked the nurse to tell her to leave. Instead, Mom appeared in the NICU doorway, spotted me through the windows, and came marching in despite the nurse trying to explain visitors needed permission. She was holding a ridiculous bouquet of pink balloons and a stuffed elephant, wearing a bright smile that faltered when she saw my face. She started talking immediately, words tumbling out about how beautiful the baby was, how she couldn't believe she was a grandmother, how this was such an exciting time. She acted like nothing was wrong, like this was a normal, happy occasion, like she hadn't ignored my emergency 4 days ago. I sat in my wheelchair staring at her, this woman who'd given birth to me, who'd fed me and clothed me and kept me alive but never quite loved me, and I felt nothing but cold clarity. She asked why I hadn't responded to her calls and texts, said she'd been so worried, said she just wanted to help. I finally spoke, voice flat and emotionless. I called you 14 times while I was in labor. She waved her hand dismissively, said they'd already been over this, their phones were off, they didn't know. I said, my text said I was hemorrhaging and might die. You read it at 7:54. I saw the read receipt. The color drained from Mom's face. She stammered that she didn't remember seeing that specific text, that she'd seen texts after the ceremony but it was so late, that she'd thought everything was fine by then, that she'd planned to call in the morning. Every word was another lie, another attempt to rewrite reality, another refusal to take responsibility. I said, you chose to stay at a party instead of calling your daughter who was dying. She got defensive then, voice rising, saying that's not fair, that they couldn't just leave Bennett's award ceremony, that it was his special night, that I was being dramatic, calling it dying, when clearly I was fine now. That word again, dramatic. It'd been dramatic as a child for wanting attention, dramatic as a teenager for being hurt by unequal treatment, dramatic as an adult for expecting my mother to answer the phone during a medical emergency. I looked at this woman and finally saw her clearly. She wasn't a flawed parent trying her best. She was someone fundamentally incapable of prioritizing me, someone who would always choose Bennett, someone who saw my nearly dying as an inconvenient interruption to his celebration. I told her to get out. Simple words, quiet words but firm. Mom looked shocked, said what, like she couldn't believe I'd dare to dismiss her. I said it louder, get out of this room. She started crying then. Those manipulative tears that had worked on me my entire childhood, saying I was being unreasonable, that she was here now wasn't that enough, that she wanted to meet her grandchild. I felt something break free inside me, some chain that had kept me compliant and quiet for 30 years, and suddenly I was yelling. My baby was dying and you chose champagne. You read that I might die, and you went to dinner. You posted on social media about the best night ever while I was in recovery from emergency surgery. My voice echoed through the NICU, and nurses were rushing over, and Wyatt was suddenly there, pulling me back from where I'd tried to stand from the wheelchair. Dad appeared then, drawn by the commotion, trying to play peacemaker like he always did when Mom's behavior created conflict. He said let's not overreact, that I was emotional from hormones and surgery, that we could talk about this calmly later. Overreact. I'd almost died and they'd ignored me and I was overreacting. I turned on him with fury I'd never expressed before. You called me princess my whole life but treated me like I was worthless. My baby's heart stopped beating and you wouldn't answer your phone. I hemorrhaged on an operating table alone because you decided an award dinner was more important than your daughter's life. Dad stepped back, genuinely shocked by my outburst, and said I wasn't alone, I had Wyatt, that he was sure everything was handled just fine. He truly believed that. Truly thought that having my husband present meant I didn't need my parents, that their absence was acceptable because I had someone else. Mom was wailing now, full theatrical crying, saying I was tearing the family apart over nothing, that she'd never intended to hurt me, that I was always so sensitive. Bennett appeared in the doorway with Sienna and their baby, drawn by the noise, asking what all the yelling was about. I looked at my brother, this person who'd received every ounce of our parents' love and attention, while I'd scraped by on whatever crumbs fell from his table, and I felt something shift into perfect clarity. I asked him directly, "Did you read my text saying the baby was in distress and I couldn't reach Mom and Dad?" He looked uncomfortable, glanced at our parents, then said, "Yeah, Head's seen it, but it was their special night and he didn't want to worry them over what he assumed was me being dramatic." There it was. Head read my emergency text and decided his award ceremony was more important than making sure his sister and niece survived. Sienna, with monumental poor timing, chose that moment to chime in with, "Maybe if I wasn't always seeking attention, people would take my emergencies more seriously." The room went silent. Even Mom looked shocked by that statement. Wyatt, who'd been remarkably restrained until that point, stepped forward and told everyone to get out in a voice I'd never heard from him before, cold and commanding. "Dad said we can't just be kept from our grandchild, that they had rights." Wyatt pulled out his phone and said he was calling security, that everyone needed to leave now, that I was a patient recovering from major surgery, and they were causing a disturbance. Mom grabbed my hand, pleading, saying I couldn't do this, that family forgives family, that we'd get past this. I pulled my hand away and said, "You tore this family apart 30 years ago when you decided I wasn't worth loving as much as Bennett." Dad argued that wasn't fair, that they'd always loved me equally, that I was rewriting history. I said I had evidence, years of evidence, a lifetime of being second choice. Bennett said this was ridiculous, that they'd come to support me and I was being ungrateful. I looked at him and said, "You came to ease your guilt, not to support me. It won't work." Security arrived then, 2 large men who assessed the situation quickly. Wyatt explained I was recovering from traumatic surgery, that these visitors were causing distress, that I'd asked them to leave. The security guards very professionally but firmly began escorting my family out. Mom was crying loudly now, saying to anyone who'd listen that her daughter was keeping her from her grandchild over a missed phone call, making herself the victim. Dad was arguing with security about patient rights. Bennett was recording on his phone, probably already composing his social media post about the crazy sister. The last thing I heard as they disappeared down the hall was Mom saying to Dad that I'd always been jealous and difficult, that this was just like me to cause drama. Those words, floating back to me in the quiet NICU, should have hurt. They would have hurt yesterday. But today, sitting beside my daughter's incubator with Wyatt's hand on my shoulder, I felt nothing but relief. They'd revealed themselves completely. No more excuses, no more benefit of the doubt, no more hoping they'd change. They were exactly who they'd always been, and I was finally done pretending otherwise. The aftermath was immediate and severe. A nurse came to sedate me because my blood pressure had spiked dangerously from the confrontation, and the last thing I remember before the medication took effect was Wyatt on the phone with his parents asking them to come help, explaining what had happened, his voice thick with anger and sorrow. When I woke hours later, it was evening, and Wyatt's mother Karen was sitting beside my bed knitting. She looked up when I stirred, smiled gently, and said, "Hello, sweetheart," in the kind of voice mothers use when they actually care. I started crying, deep wrenching sobs that hurt my incision, but I couldn't stop. Karen set down her knitting and took my hand, not saying anything, just being present while I fell apart. When I could finally speak, I asked why my own mother couldn't do this, couldn't just sit with me and care. Karen said something I'd never forget. "Some people aren't capable of real love. It's not your fault. It was never your fault." Wyatt returned with coffee and found his mother comforting me. Head spent the last few hours handling logistics, and his face was grim when he told me what Head done. Head formally requested through hospital administration that my family be banned from visiting, citing the disturbance they'd caused and my medical need for stress-free recovery. The hospital had agreed, placing official notices on my room and in the NICU that my parents, brother, and sister-in-law were not permitted to visit or contact me. Mom had already called the hospital mainline 4 times trying to get through. Dad had threatened legal action, but the hospital's legal team had shut it down immediately, explaining that patients have absolute right to refuse visitors. I should have felt guilty, should have felt like I'd done something wrong, but all I felt was protected. Bennett wasted no time taking to social media. By that evening, Head posted on Facebook about family drama, about how his sister wouldn't let them meet their niece over some misunderstanding, about how hurt they all were to be shut out. The post was carefully worded to make them look like victims, and me look like the aggressor. He didn't mention the 14 ignored calls, or the emergency texts, or the champagne toasts while I was in surgery. just presented a one-sided story where they'd arrived to visit and been cruelly turned away. The comments flooded in from extended family taking their side. An aunt I barely knew wrote that I was being selfish and vindictive. A cousin said family is forever and I needed to forgive and move on. My grandmother, Dad's mother, called me directly, leaving a voicemail about how I was destroying the family over grudges, how I should be ashamed. Not a single person asked for my side of the story. They just automatically believed Bennett's version because he was Bennett, golden child who could do no wrong, and I was Harper, difficult daughter who'd always caused problems. 1 week after my daughter was born, I was discharged from the hospital, though she had to stay in the NICU for continued monitoring. Wyatt and I checked into a hotel 5 minutes from the hospital so I could visit her multiple times daily. The hotel was modest, just a room with a bed and a kitchenette, but it became our sanctuary. Karen and Wyatt's father Tom had flown in from Louisiana and split their time between the hotel and the hospital, bringing meals, handling laundry, doing all the invisible labor that keeps life functioning during crisis. I watched Karen cook scrambled eggs in the hotel kitchenette and felt a strange grief, not just for what I'd lost with my own mother, but for what I'd never had in the first place. This is what maternal love looked like: showing up without being asked, helping without keeping score, caring because caring is what mothers do. Physical recovery was slow. The incision across my lower abdomen burned and pulled with every movement. I was exhausted constantly, still anemic from blood loss, and pumping milk every 3 hours around the clock. But the physical pain was manageable compared to the emotional devastation of my family's betrayal. I'd check my phone compulsively, seeing the notifications pile up. Mom calling, Dad calling, texts from Bennett, messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, all telling me to reconcile. I didn't respond to any of it. Wyatt had taken control of my social media accounts after Bennett's post, knowing I was too fragile to handle what was coming. Had shown me just enough to prepare me. The extended family had chosen sides, and most of them chose Bennett. Sienna posted on Instagram about being heartbroken that she couldn't meet her niece because of family grudges, complete with a photo of her looking wistfully at baby clothes. An aunt I'd seen maybe 5 times in my life texted saying, "How can you keep a baby from her grandparents over 1 missed call?" As if 14 missed calls and ignored emergency texts could be reduced to 1 missed call. A cousin wrote that I was being vindictive and needed to forgive. My father's mother, Grandma Ruth, who'd always favored Bennett anyway, left multiple voicemails about how family is forever, how I was being dramatic, how I needed to stop this nonsense and let them meet the baby. Everyone had an opinion about my situation, without knowing the actual facts, without asking my side, without caring what I'd been through. I broke. I couldn't stand watching Bennett's lies spread unchallenged. Couldn't stand being painted as the villain when I was the victim. Couldn't stand the chorus of voices telling me to forgive people who'd nearly let me die. So I wrote a Facebook post, fingers shaking on my phone screen, and I told the truth. Every detail. The childhood of being second choice, the pregnancy neglect, the 37-week labor, the 14 phone calls, the emergency texts with read receipts, the hemorrhage, the social media posts while I was in surgery. I wrote it all in clear chronological order with screenshots of texts showing timestamps and read receipts. I posted photos of my hospital bracelet from the surgery, medical discharge papers with dates and times, everything that proved my story. I titled it, "Why I'm Cutting Off My Family, The Truth They Don't Want You to Know." I hit post before I could second-guess myself. The response was immediate and split. Within 2 hours, the post had been shared over 500 times. Half the comments were supportive. Strangers and acquaintances saying, "You deserved better, protect your peace. They showed you who they are, believe them. No child should ever feel second best." The other half were critical, people saying I was airing dirty laundry publicly, that family business should stay private, that I was trying to ruin Bennett's reputation out of jealousy. That word again, jealousy. As if wanting equal parental love was somehow envious rather than a basic human need. Mom called within 15 minutes of the post going live, absolutely hysterical, screaming about how could I humiliate them publicly, how dare I make them look bad, what would people think? I told her people would think the truth, that Shed ignored her daughter's medical emergency to stay at a party. She hung up on me. Dad called next, voice cold with fury, saying I needed to delete the post immediately. Think of Bennett's career. Think of how this made the family look. I said I'd thought about Bennett for 30 years while nobody thought about me. He said if I didn't delete it, he'd sue me for defamation. I asked Wyatt if Dad could actually do that, and Wyatt researched it immediately, then called back on speakerphone telling Dad that truth is an absolute defense to defamation, that I had evidence proving every claim, that any lawsuit would be dismissed and make them look even worse. Dad sputtered about disrespect and family loyalty before hanging up. Bennett sent a text threatening legal action, saying I was destroying his reputation, demanding I take down the post. I blocked his number, then I blocked Mom's, then Dad's, then Sienna's. I went through my phone and blocked every family member who'd sent critical messages. It felt like cutting away infected tissue, painful but necessary. The unexpected part was the support from people I'd barely expected. Dad's sister, my Aunt Teresa, who lived in New Mexico and I'd only seen at major holidays, sent a private message saying she believed me, that she'd watched how they treated me growing up, that she was sorry she'd never spoken up. She said she'd seen the pattern for years, watched them pour resources into Bennett while I struggled, watched them dismiss my achievements while celebrating his mediocrity. She apologized for being complicit in her silence and said she supported my decision to protect myself and my daughter. Several cousins I'd been close to growing up messaged privately to say they'd noticed the favoritism too, that they were sorry, that they understood why I'd cut contact. A friend from high school commented publicly that my family had always been weird about Bennett, that at my 18th birthday party my own parents had spent the whole time talking about his baseball prospects while I stood alone by the cake. My daughter came home from the NICU after 18 days, tiny but healthy, no longer needing oxygen support or special monitoring. Bringing her to our apartment was surreal and terrifying and wonderful. Wed moved to a new place during her NICU stay, a 2-bedroom apartment in a different neighborhood where my family didn't know the address. Wyatt had handled everything while I recovered. Packing our old place, hiring movers, setting up the nursery. Wed changed our phone numbers but kept the old ones active just to see how many times my family would try to contact us. The old phones filled with messages, dozens per day at first, then slowly tapering off as they realized we weren't responding. 2 months after my daughter's birth, Mom showed up at our apartment building. I don't know how she found the address until I realized Bennett was still listed as an emergency contact on my old lease paperwork from when Wed lived together years ago before I met Wyatt. I was home alone with the baby when the doorbell rang. I checked the peephole and saw Mom standing there holding shopping bags from Target, probably full of baby clothes and toys, wearing what I'd come to recognize as her performance face. I didn't open the door. She rang again, knocked, called through the door that she just wanted to talk, that she'd brought gifts, that she was sorry for everything and wanted to start over. I stood on the other side of that door with my daughter in my arms and said through the wood, "No." Mom started crying, loud sobbing meant to manipulate me into opening the door. She said her grandchild was on the other side of that door, that she had rights, that I couldn't keep family apart. I said the only right she had was the one I gave her, and I wasn't giving her any. She asked what she had to do, how she could fix this, what would make me forgive her. I opened the door just a crack, kept the chain lock engaged, and looked at my mother's face red and blotchy from crying. I said, "I needed you to answer your phone when I was dying. It's too late now, you can't fix what you broke." She said people make mistakes, that she was here now, that she wanted to be part of her granddaughter's life. I said, "You made a choice, not a mistake. You saw my texts and chose to stay at a party. That's who you are. And that person isn't allowed anywhere near my child." I closed the door while she was still talking, locked it, and stood there shaking while she cried outside for another 10 minutes before finally leaving. 3 months after my daughter was born, I started therapy. Not couples therapy, not family therapy, just individual therapy to process 3 decades of trauma. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Morgan, who specialized in family dysfunction, gave my childhood a name: emotional neglect within a golden child and scapegoat dynamic. She explained that in some families, one child becomes the repository for all parental hopes and dreams, while the other becomes invisible, valued only for how they support or highlight the favored child's achievements. She said my parents' behavior during my emergency wasn't an isolated incident but the inevitable culmination of a lifetime pattern. When you've been taught that your needs don't matter, people eventually believe you when you say you're dying. They've learned to discount your pain because that's what they've always done. I started journaling as part of therapy, and one assignment was to write an unsent letter to my parents listing every moment they'd chosen Bennett over me. I filled 11 pages. Elementary school spring concert, I'd sung a solo in. They'd left at intermission for Bennett's Little League game. Middle school, when I'd won the regional spelling bee, they'd been too tired to attend the award ceremony because they'd driven Bennett to an out-of-state baseball tournament the day before. High school graduation, where I was valedictorian, they'd skipped the reception to watch Bennett's college commitment announcement. My college graduation, where I walked with honors, they'd left early to drive to Bennett's showcase game. My wedding. Arrived late from Bennett's work event. My pregnancy. Every appointment and milestone overshadowed by Bennett's promotions and achievements. The pattern was undeniable on paper, a clear record of 30 years of systematic neglect. I realized with painful clarity that this was never about me being not good enough. It was about them being incapable of loving more than one child fully. The letter-writing exercise was cathartic, but also devastating because it confirmed what I'd always suspected: this wasn't going to change. My parents didn't suddenly develop the capacity to love me equally. Bennett wasn't going to acknowledge his privilege in our family system. Extended family wasn't going to stop pressuring me to reconcile. The only thing I could control was my response, my boundaries, my protection of myself and my daughter. So I made the decision that I should have made years ago. No contact. Complete, permanent, no contact with my parents and brother. I changed my phone number and this time didn't give it to anyone who might pass it to them. I locked down all social media, blocked extended family members who kept pushing reconciliation, created a new email address for anything official. I established ironclad boundaries. My daughter's birth certificate listed only Wyatt's parents as emergency contacts. I sent a formal letter through a lawyer to my parents stating that any attempt to contact me, show up at my home, or approach me in public would be considered harassment and I'd pursue legal action. I documented everything in case they tried to sue for grandparent rights, though my lawyer assured me they'd have no case since they'd never established a relationship with my daughter. The boundaries felt harsh but necessary, like amputating a gangrenous limb to save the body. It hurt, but not as much as continuing to hope they'd change. My daughter's first birthday was small and beautiful, just Wyatt's family, a few close friends, and us. We rented a room at a local community center and decorated with butterflies and flowers. Karen made a homemade strawberry cake. Tom took about 300 photos. My daughter wore a little yellow dress and smash-caked with pure joy, frosting in her hair and on her face and all over the high chair. I cried happy tears watching her, thinking about how she'd never know the pain of competing for love, never wonder if she was enough, never feel invisible in her own family. She would be cherished, not despite anything but simply because she existed. That would be enough, because it had to be enough, because it was everything I'd never had. My family wasn't at the party. They didn't know about it, hadn't been invited, didn't get photos afterward. Bennett posted something passive-aggressive on social media that day about missing important family moments, a clear subtweet about not being at my daughter's birthday. I didn't respond, didn't engage, just kept living my life. Dad sent a birthday gift to my old address that got returned to sender. Mom tried calling from different phone numbers, but I recognized her voice on the voicemails and deleted them without listening beyond the first word. They were permanent strangers now, people I'd once known but no longer had access to any part of my life. 6 months after my daughter's birth, Bennett's life fell apart in spectacular fashion. I heard through Aunt Teresa, who'd become my only maintained family connection. Bennett got laid off when his company downsized, eliminating his position entirely. Sienna filed for divorce a month later, claiming he wasn't the man she'd married, that success had made him arrogant and distant. She moved back to her parents' house with Easton, filed for full custody, and made it clear she was done. Bennett, suddenly without job, wife, or child, reached out to me for the first time since the hospital. He texted from a new number. "Can we talk? Going through hard time and need family?" I stared at that text for a long time. Part of me felt vindicated that karma had caught up with him. Part of me felt nothing at all. I didn't respond. He called from a different number days later. I answered just to hear what he'd say. His voice was desperate, nothing like the confident golden child I'd grown up with. He said things were really hard, that he'd lost everything, that he needed support, that family should be there for family in difficult times. I let him finish, then said, "You needed me to die quietly so you could enjoy your award. We're not family." I hung up. He didn't call again. Mom reached out next through email since I'd blocked everything else. A long rambling message about how they'd made mistakes, how they saw things differently now, how watching Bennett's life crumble made them realize they'd put too much pressure on him, that maybe they'd neglected me. Maybe, that qualifier told me everything I needed to know. Even in attempting apology, they couldn't fully acknowledge what they'd done. Dad sent a letter through certified mail, formal and stiff, saying he didn't know how to fix this but wanted to try. Too little, too late. I was asked in therapy what I wanted from them. What would make things right? I realized there was nothing they could do. No apology would undo 30 years of being second choice. No explanation would justify ignoring my emergency. No amount of changed behavior now would erase the trauma of almost dying alone because they'd chosen a party over me. The damage was permanent. The best I could do was accept that, grieve for the parents I'd needed but never had, and move forward building the family I deserved. Not the family I was born into, but the family I chose. Wyatt, his parents had shown me what real parental love looked like, friends who became sisters, and most importantly, my daughter who would grow up knowing unconditional love. I became an advocate for family estrangement awareness, starting a blog called When Family Isn't Safe. I wrote about golden child syndrome, scapegoating, emotional neglect, survival after cutting off toxic family. The blog found an audience quickly, thousands of people sharing their own stories of being the overlooked child, the forgotten sibling, the scapegoat who finally walked away. I realized my pain had purpose beyond my own healing. It helped other people feel less alone, validated experiences they'd been told to minimize or forget, gave permission to prioritize their well-being over family obligation. Bennett's ex-wife Sienna reached out through the blog's contact form months later. She said she'd found my writing, that it helped her understand her marriage differently, that Bennett had treated her the way our parents had treated me, with conditional regard based on how well she supported his image. We became unlikely friends, two women who'd loved Bennett in different ways, and both learned he was incapable of returning that love fully. My daughter is 18 months old now as I'm finishing this story. She walks, says a dozen words, laughs with her whole body, reaches for me when she's scared or tired or just wants comfort. I answer every time. I show up to every moment. I celebrate her achievements not because they reflect well on me, but because they're hers and she deserves celebration. I've never once compared her to anyone else's child. I've never made her compete for my attention. She will grow up knowing she's enough exactly as she is, and that knowledge will be the foundation for every relationship she builds for the rest of her life. Breaking the cycle isn't passive, it's active work, constant attention, deliberate choices. But it's the most important work I'll ever do. I look at photos sometimes from before, pictures of me as a child standing slightly apart from the family group, Bennett in the center with parents' hands on his shoulders while I hover at the edge. I look different in those photos, smaller somehow, trying to take up less space. I look at photos now, me holding my daughter, both of us laughing at something Wyatt said off camera, and I look solid, grounded, present. The difference is stark. Healing isn't just about feeling better, it's about becoming yourself for the first time, stepping into the space you were always meant to occupy, but were taught to vacate for someone else's comfort. Do my parents ever think about what they lost? About the daughter they had who needed them? About the granddaughter they'll never know? I don't know. I hope they do. I hope at quiet moments they remember 14 missed calls and feel the weight of what that means. I hope they see my daughter's photo that Aunt Teresa shared despite my wishes and feel the absence of what they chose to walk away from. But whether they do or not isn't my concern anymore. Their regret can't heal my wounds. Their realization can't undo their choices. The only person who can heal me is me, and that's what I'm doing, one day at a time, one boundary at a time, one choice to prioritize my well-being at a time. The lesson isn't about forgiveness. Everyone will tell you to forgive, to let go, to move on for your own peace. But I've found peace without forgiving. I've found freedom without reconciliation. The lesson is that you don't owe anyone access to your life just because you share DNA. Family isn't biology, it's action, it's showing up, it's answering the phone, it's choosing someone's well-being over your comfort. My parents failed that test repeatedly, culminately, catastrophically. They proved they weren't safe people to have in my life or my daughter's life. Accepting that truth, acting on that truth, protecting myself based on that truth isn't cruel, it's survival. It's self-love. It's the most important gift I can give my daughter. A mother who knows her worth and teaches her daughter to know hers too. They ignored my calls when I was dying, so I stopped calling altogether, and for the first time in my life, I can finally breathe. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the forgotten child in your family? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own well-being? Drop a comment below sharing your story, because I know I'm not alone in this, and neither are you. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own family dynamics, if it helped you feel less alone, please hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I'll be sharing more stories about family dysfunction, healing, and breaking generational cycles. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's struggling with the decision to set boundaries with toxic family. Someone who needs permission to prioritize themselves. Thank you for listening to my story, for witnessing my pain, for validating that what happened to me was real and wrong and not my fault. I'm sending strength to everyone navigating difficult family situations. You deserve better. You always deserved better. And choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's sacred. Take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and remember, you don't owe anyone your suffering. Stay strong, stay hopeful, and know that healing is possible even when family isn't.